I'm Carrington McDuffie. This is Star Seeds of Freedom. Welcome and thank you for being here. We are in a time of questioning where we are questioning everything. I mean, as I grew up, I was taught to question authority, and we really have to question all authority now because we've seen what authority can do when you're not paying attention. And this brings us into some really tricky areas. So for that reason, I'm thrilled to have with me today, and relieved, someone with a really heightened intellect and a way of being able to address things for the layman, as we call ourselves, and also to explain things with panache. And so that's really wonderful. Someone who can navigate some of these tricky waters for us and with us. SG Anon, so happy to have you with us today. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
So where I wanted to start today, I'll lay the groundwork as quickly as I can. I was raised in the Episcopalian Church, and as a very small child, I remember thinking, learning about God as a loving God, and yet a jealous and an angry God, one who could incinerate entire cities. And that never seemed right to me. I didn't really want to bow to that God, even as like a 5-year-old. That just seemed like, what? And then there was Jesus Christ, who loved little children, who loves little children, and that spoke to me very clearly. And I feel like there is a dichotomy there in the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that led me to explore the works of Mauro Biglino, who is a scholar of ancient languages, an Italian who has translated, I want to say, 19 books of the Bible for the Vatican, longtime translator for the Vatican, speaks ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, and also the work of Paul Wallis, who is a lifetime pastor and a church doctor in the Anglican Church. And both of these guys came to similar conclusions about the Old Testament, what they found in the Old Testament when they actually read it according to a literal translation, an actual translation of the ancient Hebrew in which it was recorded. And they both found evidence, very obvious evidence, of paleo-contact, and a very, very different picture being painted of what the Vatican then, intervening translations have shown us. And there, I think, are different reasons for that, some very obvious reasons and some other really interesting reasons. I was hoping we could talk about this a little bit because it's a really difficult and controversial area, and for that reason, I think we need to talk about it and because it connects what we're starting to see with UFOs and ETs and all this conspiracy theory stuff. And the more we see of conspiracy theories coming true, the more we realize, we have to rethink this whole thing. And then also our spiritual life and our religious life. And anytime you bring an institution to something, in this case, spirituality, you bring an institution to it and call it religion, there starts to be authority and hierarchy. And this is where I kind of slip out sideways and go, okay, I want to ask some questions about this because I don't submit well to authority when it's telling me that my God is jealous and angry and destructive and loving. And the contradictions there are just so profound. So I'm finding really interesting answers to these questions that I'm not an atheist. They don't, for me at all, exclude God or godness. For me, it's like source of everything. And I wanted to talk with you about this today. So I'm really happy that you're here. And I just, anything that you have to say about this, there's a lot of information. I have a ton of notes, but I wanted to lay that groundwork, at least from my point of view. How do we wade into this?
Carrington, that might be the tallest opening question of any broadcast that I've done yet to date. And I have to say, I appreciate the depth and the gravity. It is an important conversation. It is centered around, I think, a cornerstone of Western society and an understanding that is present in Western society about the type of world we live in, about who we are. And really we're seeing some unearthings of this, in almost like a tantular fashion with the entirety of the Great Awakening, right? The Great Awakening in science, the Great Awakening in healthcare, medicine, acoustics and physics, things like this, the realization that we are something more, that we are sonic beings, that we're light based, that we're connected directly to God's Holy Spirit. Me personally, I'm going to open this segment by saying that I'm not a spiritual or biblical scholar. I'm someone who tries to be studious about, reading the good book and understanding the things that are out there, but also I try to be very broad and open-minded in the sense that my microcosmic viewpoint of several thousand years of human history is likely less than completely informed. And I always try to come at it with that lens because it's so important to understand the obfuscation component. There has been obfuscation in our holy books. This is just a factual basis that we need to start at to open the discussion because it provides us the understanding of why the discussion can be difficult. We're literally operating with incomplete information most of the time. And we have to step back and appreciate that the additional information may not come directly from the book as they have left it in the current time. Be found in the writings of scholars and religious philosophers and those associated with the church, perhaps even some of those associated with Christ in those days, that may not be included in that catechismic text that we're given, right? But it's worth drawing the wisdom and looking at those perspectives and trying to glean what may have been truthful, what may have been not truthful, from those, we'll call them extra biblical sources. Now, the question that you asked is really enormous. How do we approach the concept of what God is? Again, I come at this from the Christian lens, and so I look at it as the triune God of all is intricately involved in the all of all things, and that's a very almost like a gratuitous statement in some regards, but it is meant to highlight that we have constant interactivity, constant connectivity, constant presence with the Holy Spirit that sustains the very reality that we are a part of. We enter into a physical flesh and body suit. We have a spiritual experience in a physical body. We walk through a journey of life fundamentally to identify the things that we prefer, to identify an individualized perspective that only we can uniquely offer to the world. And I think that's the joy of God dancing with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden from the days of old. We're just doing it in a different way based on the events of human history. And again, I don't subscribe to understand fully what those are. We can go back and look at the Old Testament. You can look at the New Testament. There's a lot of really good, archaeological references for this. But understanding who we are in the grand chorus of things, I think it really should start with a humility place more than anything else, right? God is not to be put in a box, and that's always something that I've believed in my own personal walk. We have a very human point of view. We come into an egocentric body that has a balance with an emotional body and a spiritual body. We are an interdimensional being, so we have connectivity to things that we really don't fully understand, but there are resources of that Holy Spirit that are there for our betterment. But at the same time, we may not be, and this is the case that I make, I should say, for folks out there that have a hard time with some of these concepts. We may not be the only life form that God has created for that enjoyment and that betterment, right? And we know that God is a God of order, and so light must accompany dark, sick must accompany well. There is a duality in the universe that helps us to highlight, what things are. How can we know what we like if we don't have some experience with what we don't like? Is sort of the age-old question.
Yeah.
And because God is a God of order, I think that God allows negative imprinted beings, we'll call them lower frequency, lower vibrational beings that are not entirely humanoid. Perhaps they have some humanoid forms, but they exist in a state of almost holy enmity, if you will, with a lighter based, a love based consciousness, which I believe human beings are the epitome, the apex extension of here in the world that we live in. We are the spiritual regency, we're the spiritual royalty. That's one of the reasons that these beings that I'm referencing there hate us. I talked a little bit about a race referenced as the Vril. This is a race that has come up. I think you and I have even talked about it on the program before. They're an extraterrestrial, if you want to call it that race, a non-terrestrial race. I call them a subterrestrial race, a lower vibrational being race, and so their purpose in life is to parasite sort of off of the life force of those higher level beings. You could call them demons. I think a lot of the terminology throughout the ages has become conflated as we've tried to describe what these other beings, what these other encounters really are. The Old Testament, a great deal of it that was written, in a literal, sense, has been removed or purged from the historic record. We have massive gaps in timelines. We have massive gaps in chronological events discussing the events of kingdoms that you can glean from study of the Old Testament. And you look at the archaeology that's on the ground there in most of that area of the world. And so the question becomes why? And I submit that the text has been attacked over the years, over the centuries, really, to remove the types of references that we're discussing as far as these paleo encounters, these otherworldly being encounters, what they really may or may not be. And so it becomes a sort of, circular topic in some regards as we can get caught up in the terminology and we can really, come off base, I think, when we're trying um, have an intellectual discussion about what our actual history really is and what it actually looks like. I submit to the audience and the viewership out there, especially the viewership of your show, knowing their sort of receptivity and flavor for the very fringe and open topics, that humanity may not be the only life form created to help glorify God in this grand chorus. And if that is the case, then we should acknowledge that there is a major spiritual component of our understanding of who we are and how we fit into that grand chorus that is completely missing from our religious record, from our church record, from our spiritual record. And of course, the answer to the why behind that question, why is it missing, is because of who we are, because of what it would allow us to operate with. When you are a fearless being operating in spiritual confidence, there's nothing that can stop you. There's no force of heaven, hell, or in between, and certainly no force of man that can prevent you from leveraging your connection to the Holy Spirit to build out and carve out the direction you want to go in life. And if you operate in a fearless capacity, a fearless sense, and perfect love does cast out fear, then you're essentially an unterrorizable and you essentially become a population that cannot be controlled through any type of fear-based totalitarian structure or any type of wanton control, this over that type of thing. And so that's why they've kept us, my own personal opinion, that's why they've kept us in this state of confusion and disarray. They've left out a major component of our history, a major component of who we are before God and before each other. And until we start with the understanding, I think, that that is the point we have to begin at, we're not going to have, I think, the conversation on this topic that we need to be having.
Well, I love what you're saying, how you're framing that, because the whole question, without getting into the details, and they're fascinating, and I do encourage people to look further into it, and I can get into that a little bit later or in the show notes, but it points us to this broader, deeper view or sense um, of the divine, right? And I mean, we're going to get into some politics later in this time that we have today together, but I really wanted to lay this groundwork first because everything that you said is the same way that I feel oriented in general, that broader, deeper sense that we can rejoice in of our own divinity. That's where we really have to come from in order to be able to take on the madness of these times and the questions that we have without being completely doubled over in fear and cowering, and as you say, that's where they've kept us, because it's a very convenient place for them. When I say them, I'm talking about the deep state and other entities. It's a very convenient place for them to have us because it's a lot easier to control a populace that's afraid than a populace that's partying and, exploring and trusting in their own divinity. And I just wonder what you think about this, um, that when we separate ourselves from God, even by calling God as if God's an entity, we sort of get into trouble right away. Um, because as soon as you make that separation, you've denigrated yourself. And I think if we're divine emanations of spirit, then we're not below anything. I mean, as you say, there's a you referred to the vril as I'm not sure exactly. What did you say? Sub
Subterrestrial life forms.
right. Okay, so a lower vibration. So in that sense, um, there are levels of there are hierarchical levels, right? When you talk about vibration, which everything is made of, but at the same time, we're not less than because we're just part of. So I like to think of source as just it's not gender driven. It's not, I know that in Christianity, God is defined primarily as male, and that's because Yahweh was a male figure. And actually, that was a council of beings when you read the literal interpretation. And then Jesus was a man. But I think a lot has been pulled from the Bible and pulled from our understanding over the millennia to, demonize the feminine principle, which is the principle of healing and ever flowing life force. So it's beyond gender, right? We are of it. And that's enough about that. I didn't mean to sermonize, but I just feel like it's a really important platform for us to be able to function from in these crazy times because this is our moment, right? This is the moment that we can overtake these lower vibrations that have been holding us in thrall and become what we really are capable of being, as you say, and be able to rejoice in all of that. So, having said all that, it's just so awesome to have you to be able to discuss this with.
At the end of the day, I enjoy the candidness of conversations like this because there is a judgment-free space that is offered, and that's the initial presentation I think we have to come to, right? I may come to the discussion with a constellation of beliefs and understandings that I am not willing to come off of for whatever reason. But that does not mean that I have to hold the other party in the same type of expectation, and the vice versa, I think, is always true. And the true definition of open-mindedness, if we want to call it that, is allowing someone else to make the case for a belief system primarily or an understanding of the world that may be out of, we'll say, out of line or out of sync, or perhaps, an addendum to the current concepts and the current constructs that we may have. One of the most interesting discussions about, or one of the most interesting topics, I should say, off of the discussion that we're broaching on this, concept of God and spirituality itself is this male versus feminine. And while I do espouse the male view in many regards, and you could say I'm quite literally biased biologically in some way with that, the acknowledgement of the divine feminine component of God, the divine feminine component of what Christ was teaching everyone, and one of the reasons that it has been a tradition essentially in all of human history for women to have long hair, which is richly filled with copper and very electroconductive, is because there is a component to the divine feminine that is not available to the divine masculine. And the same is true in reverse, right? And we have the manifestation evidence of that in the concept male and female in the animal kingdom, certainly in humanity, and really across all life forms that are not flora based. This balance of the masculine and the feminine, the right and the left. Some people say the yin and the yang. It doesn't particularly matter what you call it. One is much more concerned, I think, with the forwardness of life and the vitality and the power and the the zealotry that comes from this exhilarating life experience. And then the other is concerned with the beauty and the savoring and the slow process of appreciating things for what they truly, are, and almost like a sitting still. That's not really the right word for it. It's I don't want to, gender stereotype inappropriately, but it's a much more deliberate, much more patient, much more compassionate view of this journey through life, this spiritual experience that we're all living in. And that Holy Spirit of the living God that Christ left those apostles and taught us a great deal about expresses both of those in almost a sacred balance that is really the reason the deep state hates mankind so
Yes.
much. We represent a balance between, or a balance within, I should say, a limitless force of nature, a limitless creative power of all that is. And they cannot control it. And try as they might, they cannot invert it. They cannot control it. They can't torture us enough to extract the spiritual connection from us. They can't corrupt us enough to disconnect us from that connection. We are forever sort of covered with that regency, right? And Christ came to reinforce that with the covenant that he gave to the followers that he had in those days, and those followers would later go out and tell the people that they had the power, that they were, beloved of God, that they were not forgotten by their great Father. And so this was, a personal empowerment, again, an ignition of confidence in the populace that was so blatant and so threatening to the status quo of that day, particularly the Pharisee and Sadducee driven status quo, that it actually made Yeshua the Christ the enemy essentially of the local government there in that arena, and they would later go on and execute him for it.
Yeah.
And so where we're at in today's world, I think, is a macro realization of the same events that occurred in Judea and Samaria around 20 to 30 BC, right? 33 BC being, I think, the commonly accepted date for the death of Christ. So you figure, excuse me, maybe 3 to 4 years before that, we would have teaching that would be beginning around age 30 in the rabbinic sense. The man would have been very schooled, I think, in the years leading up to that ministry.
Yes.
So we'll say 20 to 33 BC, this 10-year period of time in Judea and Samaria, we have this message that gets put out to the people that encourages them to not only repent, but to also forgive, to forgive themselves, to forgive others, to let the old be the old and create the new, to focus on the new covenant, the new way, the new path. I give each of you a new command, right? That's the verse, I believe. And so that was a very empowering moment for human history, granted on a microcosmic scale. And now we're seeing that moment panned out on a macro scale worldwide as people come into the realization of who they are as men, of who they are as women, of who they are as human beings, and of who they are as it relates to one another. And that is the deep state's literal existential worst nightmare.
Yes. Isn't it awesome? I love being the deep state's worst nightmare. It's really, this is the time. And everything that Christ taught, the kingdom is within, that you have the power, you shall do all this and more. I'm not quoting it exactly right, but that's the whole thing. It hasn't been quoted exactly right. That's where I began with all this. But this is our time to do that. And when, repent, that really isn't about guilt. That's about letting go and embracing your own power. So that's what we need to do. I think we are doing it. And a lot of the questions that come up for us all, I mean, I don't want to get too much deeper into this because we could go on for hours and we have a limited time. And I'm not going to get deep into Biglino and Paul Wallis in this discussion, but it does bring up these questions that it's time to embrace and open our minds to. And I love what you said about being open-minded because that's really essential for us to heal as a species at this time and come together. We the people, we need to be open-minded with each other and to realize the kingdom is of God is within, and there's our power. So, but the question that keeps coming up for people is, how long is this going to take? This, are we there yet? And I ask myself this question every day. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. And we don't even know what there is, right? When we look at world events, and you've been so encouraging to so many listeners and really boosted morale while still being very glued to the facts of the matter. So I wanted to enter into that realm some, the so-called facts of the matter. So coming from the question of what's in the Old Testament and how we've been influenced by that, I want to shift gears and ask you, okay, so where are we with what is Zionism? If you look up Zionism, it just says support for the state of Israel as a homeland for the Jews. Okay, so that's a very simple, straightforward definition of it. But I wanted to broaden that and look at, well, how most members of Congress have dual citizenship in Israel and what is going on, this is another really thorny question because we have a lot of people who support Israel and are looking at it from the point of view of Israel versus Palestine, but it's so much of a bigger question than that. And of course, we know the deep state has headquarters in Israel, so there's that. And can we venture into this a little bit about what is Zionism today and where does it stand on the world stage regarding the takedowns that are happening and the questions that you and I are exploring in this conversation?
I do apologize. Most of the question was interrupted on this end, but if I'm not mistaken, the flavor was essentially around the concept of Zionism versus the ancient Hebrew people, the current state of Israel versus the people of Israel, and how this fits into the religious lens that we have, the belief understanding that we have in the Western world. Is that correct?
That's most of it. That's part of it. And just what is Zionism today, given the fact that most of our Congress, for instance, has dual passports in Israel? Like, what is the state of Zionism on the world stage as these things are being, as a lot of questions are being answered and things are being revealed? Um, what are the aims of Zionism and where does it stand, along with everything else that you said?
Well, again, I want to highlight for the audience out there that I come at this from a more research-based, lens rather than a spiritual scholar
Yes,
lens. And I
yes,
really try to not take sides on things. So I'll try to be
yes.
very precise and specific in the terminology. The concept of Zionism didn't exist prior to the 18th century. As a matter of fact, it emerged from Central Europe out of some secret society circles that traced some Jewish lineage, or excuse me, traced their Jewish lineage in those days to the Italian nobilities of the Knights Templar days. So the figure the 13th through 16th centuries throughout Central and Southern Europe. And the Zionist movement essentially became a blanket PR campaign to give a homeland to the Jews. And when we talk about the Jews, we're not just talking about the ancient Israelite people. We're not just talking about the ancient Hebrew bloodlines, the bloodlines of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're also talking about a co opted bloodline known as the Ashkenazi Jewish bloodline that came out of what is modern day Lebanon and Syria and the far northwestern reaches of Iraq, migrating northward through the Eurasian steppes, or excuse me, through the Eurasian desert and plains into what is now eastern Turkey and the Azerbaijan region. And that particular group of Jewry actually traces the male lineage, the male bloodline of that particular group, all of the way back to the Phoenicians of the days of old. And so, if we rely on the Old Testament for some of that perspective, you will recall that the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, were actually the enmity. They were the opposite of the kingdom and people of Israel, the Hebrew people of God, and Yahweh, the council of Yahweh, actually encouraged the Hebrew people of God, the true blood lineage of Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to remove that particular Phoenician obstacle in those days. Now, again, this is a summary of the history that I've looked at. I'm not a professor, but this is my understanding of things. So we move forward throughout the centuries. We have this segment of Jewry that gets created around the 9th century in response to an ultimatum that was given by a Russian-led coalition, Vladimir the Great, Tsar Vladimir the Great in those days. And that Russian-led coalition's ultimatum was, as a kingdom of thieves and kidnappers and Luciferian dark occult paganists, which was a kingdom known as Khazaria back in those days, you can convert to one of the three main world religions, and those religions are Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And they opted for the second of the three. They opted to co opt the Judaism faith line, and they did not actually convert at that royal level. The kingdom of Khazaria itself converted. All of the people took an oath to this new way of life. But the ruling class, the royal family, those bearing the blood lineage going back to the Canaanites and Phoenicians of old, continued the dark occult practices underground. When the Russian coalition discovered that this had occurred a couple of years later, And forgive me on a couple of years. It may have been a few years later, it may have been more than a decade. I can't remember the history right off the top of my head, but it was within a period of time, relatively short period of time, where the Russians discovered that this agreement had essentially been broken and that these practices were continuing. Russian children were continuing to disappear. Merchants coming along the Silk Road were continuing to not arrive at their locations. And the Russian coalition went into Khazaria and attempted to destroy the kingdom and actually ended up splintering the kingdom and ejecting the ruling class west. The ruling class got essentially ahead of that invasion force and rebranded themselves in southeastern and central Europe over the centuries. So the concept of Zionism then comes into play the 18th and 19th centuries. The Rothschild dynasty, an Ashkenazi Jewish dynasty, born primarily from the Meyer Amschel Rothschild patriarchy, I believe that was in the mid 18th century, is a very big and candid fan of this, along with the various Jewry in Europe at the time. And so we saw, excuse me, throughout the 19th century, a campaign to establish a Zionist state, a state of Israel in the modern sense. This campaign was discussed as early on paper, I believe, in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. And during this 19th and early 20th century period of time where this geopolitical football is getting tossed around the map, you're also seeing that same central banking cartel, that's child driven and European royal driven hegemony, essentially utilizing the power of the British Royal Navy and the corporate power of things like the British East India Company to subjugate the entirety of most of the world. We fast forward to 1917, we have the Balfour Declaration from Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild in that day. And then any good researcher out there is acutely aware that over the next 30 to 40 years, or excuse me, the next 20 to 30 years, we saw the development, the landscape literally play out at the world stage to create the nation state of Israel. Now, this is where it gets really hairy for believers out there
Yeah.
because the book talks about the prophecy of the restoration of the state of Israel, the people, the bloodline, the Hebrew people of the state of Israel. And yet the book does not particularly give us a good definition for what qualifies as the true people of Israel, what God's people are, and how that definition translates to the modern day. The state of Israel, for example, has a corporate registration number that's actually tied to Kensington Palace in London. It's not a real entity in and of its own right. It's actually a corporate fiction in the same sense that the United States of America government post 1871 has also been a corporate fiction. And so if we use a little bit of back engineering from that, it's not likely then, just in my own personal opinion, that the Bible would be prophesying a corporation masquerading as the state and the people of Israel. It makes more sense that we would have the actual rise, the actual appearance of the bloodline of the ancient Jews, throughout the centuries to have a state of their own. So in the present day and time, the Zionist component to things and the Jewish component, as I understand it, are not entirely meshable. You have some overlap, and you certainly have some Zionist ultra Orthodox Jews who are wonderful, God-fearing people, and there's not a malevolent bone in their entire body. And yet, the Zionist government of the state of Israel has, for the last 50 years, been bleeding the American government and most of the Western world through their control of the intelligence community essentially dry like a stuck golden calf. And indeed, that is the goal of the Zionism, the political Zionism, at least in the current day and time, is to create a totalitarian world that is primarily dominated through Jewish bloodlines. As a matter of fact, one of Jeffrey Epstein's goals was to help seed a new bloodline of mankind. And so you had documents that were recovered from the New Mexico ranch discussing how he would be used to father 26 children from 26 different Gentile women. And that fulfills a prophecy that is contained within the Talmud. So the question is extremely tall and broad because you have different interpretations of the faith, you have different interpretations of the ethnic identity of the population and of the people. And I want to be very clear when I say that Ashkenazi Jews are just as much Jewish as anyone else in the world, but we do have to appreciate the origin of the title and the origin of the bloodlines themselves. There are good research studies out there coming from major Ivy League schools and some that are not major Ivy League schools at all. We have, institutes in the south of France that have done genealogical work about the relationship between Lebanon, the current state of Israel, Palestine, etc. And so, with those particular considerations in mind, I think again we have to step back and say, well, let's have an open-minded, pretty broad discussion here. Let's try and find the commonalities where we can conclude, yes, this is probably true. No, this is probably not true. And let's not be afraid to question the documents that come into that discussion, such as the bloodline reports, such as the Talmudic texts, the Torah, the scrolls of Enoch, for example, other things that have not been necessarily discussed in the mainstream have in fact been hidden from us,
Yes.
but they provide important context for this entire discussion.
Yes, and as in addition to all that, who is doing what? Look at what Epstein's doing. So there's that entire separation of who is pro-human and who appears to be really anti-human. That's a lot of actually the work that we're doing right now is sorting that out, right? Because we want the pro-human people to be in charge. So thank you for addressing that. I feel like that's another difficult topic, but it's so much more than a topic. So, all right, well, I wanted to shift gears again and return to something you and I have talked about before, which is the Constitution, and not to go deeply into the US Constitution, but as far as like what's good and what's pro-human, I would say that of the systems that are out there that I am aware of, the Constitution for the United States, the original one, is probably the best template for human sovereignty. It seems to me that it could be the template for a lot of the world. At the same time, the US, we're experiencing firsthand that the first shall be last, right? We're we're in that position right now, and that has to happen. So as you pointed out in, I think your last audio file 75, the dismantling of the deep state is being done here in the US legally. And as the US goes, so goes the rest of the world. Now, so taking that into consideration that as the US goes, so goes the rest of the world, and yet the US we're going from first to last, and yet we have the best constitution of all, and we are enacting this change as legally as we possibly can. What does that mean? Like, why does the rest of the world follow the US, and what does that look like if the US were de-dollarizing and all this stuff about the deep state being really inculcated here in the US? What does that mean that the rest of the world, as the US goes, so goes the rest of the world?
Well, the phrase itself, I think, is sort of rooted in some unusual wisdom from the control of financial markets. When you look at the entanglement, say that came from the Bretton Woods Act, later the entanglement and the ostracization and antagonism that was a result of Nixon's pulling us off the gold standard for international transactions. The U.S. has had essentially a twofold bludgeoning stick, one in each hand, for the last century and a half or so. One of those sticks was monetary, fiscal, and commercial, the other one, and legal, and the other one was militarily. And so when we say, within the United States and the domestic scene that happens within the United States, so goes the rest of the world. My understanding of that has always been primarily because whatever occurs within U.S. financial markets and within U.S. domestic politics is going to affect foreign relations with the United States of America, of which essentially every nation on earth is a party to.
Yeah.
And because of the central banking infiltration and infestation that we have around the planet, and the enforcement arm that emanates from the Pentagon and the Washington, D.C. Military industrial machine, the concept of what occurs in the U.S. affecting the rest of the world, it's sort of very easy to see how that happens. The U.S. has, I think, more than 300 different military bases throughout the entirety of the planet, a great many of them located in Central, South America, Africa, Eastern and Central and Southern Europe. all over the Pacific regions, for example, and multiple bases in Antarctica that are off book, but we know they exist. And so when we look at what's happening here in the United States and how it affects the rest of the world, and then we step back and we say, okay, if we're going to remove a worldwide deep state cancer whose primary nodes are concentrated in Western Europe, the United Kingdom, and in North America with Washington, D.C. and Ottawa, how can we do so in such a fashion that does not implode the rest of the world? And so it makes
Yes.
sense that we would actually have to start with the rest of the world and come back to us last. And we've been seeing that process playing out. The Russians have been helping the sub-African, or the sub-Saharan African nations disconnect from the Washington, D.C. aid arm, the grain imports that come from America, the fuel imports that come from America after being ratcheted up in price after we buy it from OPEC first and then sell it back for pennies on the dollar because we're idiots at that geopolitical level. Looking at how the disconnection has been occurring, I think we've been going about as fast as we can. And I talked a little bit in File 70 and on a couple of recent interviews about the conflicts that are continuing to escalate, that are continuing to occur in these major theaters of operation.
Yes.
And all of them serve a multitude of different objectives. But one of the common objectives that all of them serve is the de-dollarization of the planet, the removal of the serpent dollar from commerce systems in the Middle Eastern nations, in the South Asian nations, the Eurasian countries, certainly in the African nations, soon to be in the South American nations, I believe. And it's to rest here at home. And once we get the dollar essentially drained of its lifeblood, which is an unpleasant process for those of us that live here with the Hydra literally in our living room,
Yeah.
then we can have the discussion about redefinition. And in fact, we've already broached that discussion. Representative Massey has introduced a bill to end the Federal Reserve that was almost immediately co-sponsored by a number of representatives.
Yeah.
We have House Resolution 4763 being brought to a full discussion, ostensibly for a debate and then a vote. That resolution, about 460 pages down in an over 500-page document, details an entire commission to be created as a result of that public law to study the concept of decentralized finance within the domestic United States. So these changes are occurring in that serpent dollar system worldwide geopolitical stage, but it cannot be accomplished without I think, a degree of pain because you've got this petrodollar and the serpent dollar involved in every commercial market worldwide since 1948. With the exception perhaps of some of the Russian markets and some of the Central Asian markets, we've never truly been able to get those under that dominant hegemony. That's been the goal of the last half century, quite frankly. And looking at the handling of events here in the United States, that's going to come out to the rest of the world. If we're going to remove the dollar from the rest of the world, remove the bludgeoning arm of the U.S. military from the rest of the world, at home, we need accountability and a track record and some sort of precedent set so that we can encounter these sorts of issues both domestically and at that international stage ever again. And that, I think, is where our court system, our legal construct system comes into play. President Trump stressed multiple times during his presidency that we're a nation of laws and orders. We've got more than 200 executive orders, many of which are still active, that were signed under President Trump, which govern a lot of the behavior of the current economy, the current military footing of the United States, actions of the DHS, actions of the Central Intelligence Agency, to some degree, actions of divisions within the FBI. So this is a multi-angular legal scaffold approach to continuity of government here in the United States, and it's producing the textbook essentially by which we can prevent this from occurring ever again, and simultaneously is allowing for the flowing forward of our society while the rest of the world is freed from the constrictor.
Yes, so we have to survive that flowing forward here. And it's messing, of course, with our economy, with our actual economy. The financial system doesn't report accurately what's really going on here in our lives. So we have to survive that. And that is a big challenge. Big challenge. Uh, so we keep having these conversations to walk ourselves through this because um, this doesn't on one hand it's happening very, very fast. It's like cascading, and on the other hand it just seems to take forever because I mean there's so much debt all around the world that has to be settled in the dollar, right, that you can't just yank it out.
That's absolutely true. And you just touched a little bit at the delicateness and the reason for that type of just very shrewd, very timid, very deliberate movement forward in that worldwide market sense, because you can plunge entire societies into chaos very quickly if things aren't seamless, if they don't transfer from one nation to another, if there's some sort of obstruction on the line, or if state or hacking cell that you've not been able to isolate yet. A good example of this at a local level, what you're talking about, and preventative measures towards the same, is the Zimbabwean police effort to track down and arrest Forex currency dealers, black
Yes.
market currency dealers who carry a constellation of physical notes on their person, and they're willing to sell those notes at an exchange rate higher than the official rate. And that devalues the country currency that Zimbabwe is trying to release. And so you've actually seen a crackdown that was described in one sense as being a league between the Zimbabwean national police force and the Zimbabwean military to destroy these foreign exchange currency dealer cells within the country, track them down to neutralize them, and therefore reflect a fair value of what the gold-backed currency that the Zimbabwean government has now introduced and what that actually is. The exact same operations are occurring in Baghdad and in within cities inside Iraq right now as Iraq prepares to launch a revaluation of its dinar. That revaluation has already happened internally. Now the country is attempting to manage the black market infiltration that are on its streets, in its villages, in its towns, all through the different countrysides, that the Iraqi government has purview over. And once we see a conclusion of that process, they will produce what they believe a fair rate for their own resources and exchange to be, and that rate will either be accepted or not accepted at that grand market level. But these changes are happening. This is kinetic. This is progressing forward in real time.
Yes.
And to the point that you said a moment ago, we have to figure out how to weather the storm. That, I think, is the cosmic destiny in a lot of ways of the American people in this day and time. We were chosen for this moment. We have to manage the destruction of our own serpent dollar. It was, put around the rest of the world without our knowledge, certainly without our consent. If we understood
Yeah.
what was going on, it would have been an immediate rebellion.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, we are the ones who will take over management of that old system once we have seen it through to the end. And I think that's the magic here, is we will have the opportunity to revalue the US dollar at a fundamentally fair rate. We will have the opportunity to conduct asset-backed trade across the international border stage, and we will live to see the day where true wealth creation is made possible in the world in a fair and accountable way. And the period of chaos and turbulence that we're in right now is really towards that end.
Yes, it is. There is tremendous creativity to it. The tricky thing is that there has to be the destruction at the very same time that there's the creation, and there are things that have to be destroyed first in order for the creation to happen. But there's so much that's really simultaneous, and this is what's so delicate, right? How do we dismantle the negative aspects of the central banking system without destroying people's lives? So that's what we're undertaking now, and I think it takes a lot of guts. I mean, it takes a lot of smarts, and we have those available to us. It takes a lot of guts. We have those too. But again, these conversations, we have to keep having them to keep exploring what's really going on, and trying to understand what our part in it is. And when we talk about it, it helps us to have the guts to go through this. We have to go through it. We don't have a choice, but we weather the storm a lot better if we can have a sense of what the hell we're actually doing. But the delicacy of destroying and creating at the same time, that those are, and this is back to that yin yang thing, those are two sides of the same coin. Speaking of financial systems, so I guess, I mean, we're just about out of time here, but the delicacy of this, the fact it's happening kinetically, as you say, is so thrilling that you can look at what's happening with a dinar or see the creation of the zig. It's just awesome, and at the same time, it's terrifying because our own lives seem very threatened by what's going on. So, um, as to the time frame of this, again, it's like, are we there yet? That whole question. How long does it take till we're there? Do I don't even know if that's a relevant question, but I know people want to know. If there's anything you have to say about it, I know my audience will love to hear it.
Well, along in this process, I think we've seen some dates get put out and they have not happened, and that undermines public confidence. And then we've
Yes.
had some dates put out and they did actually occur, or they occurred in a very similar time frame, and so that builds public confidence. I think the essence of the question is, when will we know that we are winning the fight in the sense that there's economic liberation? That's the main thing that would compel the creativity, the ingenuity, the drive and innovation from we the people, is having economic freedom.
Yes.
And I would say, based on the events that we've seen, and really the statements, excuse me, and rhetoric that we've seen from President Trump and a number of other economic pulpits of power over the last, say, 6 to 8 weeks or so here in 2024, I think I would be very surprised if we get all of the way to the November election without any type of significant financial or economic event, something that would be, very noticeable very quickly.
Hmm.
And to what extent that actually looks like, Carrington, I really can't say. The financial crashes that we've lived through as a human civilization over the last 100 years have nearly all been orchestrated by the deep state control of finance at that international level.
Yes,
And they've been
indeed.
very dramatic, very off-guarding, very undermining of the ability for, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to occur. And so I think the essence of the question is, what kind of event might we be in store for? And when we if we're going to approach the hypothetical with the idea that there is a patriotic change that's occurring in the financial world, how unpleasant, how drawn out, how dramatic might that event actually be? And truthfully, I can't say.
Yeah.
But I'm increasingly more inclined to believe that it's going to have enough drama and flavor to get people's attention, but not a longitudinal enough time frame to cause significant chaos or civil problems, because you would not be able to recover from that in any type of continuity situation, be that in the United States or any other nation on the planet. And so in that process, I think, the essence of the question is, how long is it going to take until we have some economic freedom? How long is it going to take until we have a little bit of reprieve to show that we, the people, are in fact transitioning through a financial death and rebirth moment? And the answer, I think, is sometime perhaps within the next 9 to 12 months. We should see something, I think, that's absolutely concrete. That's not a hard and fast prediction. I mean, these types of things could spawn off in the next 6 weeks, depending on the activities of treaties that have happened worldwide, the activities behind this House resolution bill, which discusses the decentralization of finance. I think
Yes.
there's more than 15 U.S. states now that have legislation working its way through their state-based legislatures, those miniaturized Congresses in the 50 states of the Union, that are discussing essentially an asset-backed currency, and codifying into public law, that they pass those legislatures, they would codify into public law a repudiation of digital or fiat currency as the main method of value exchange. So these events are happening. They're moving forward in real time. The pacing behind that, I think, is anybody's guess in some regards. But what is not at a guess here, what is pretty much commonly agreed upon by patriots and even those normies out there who are beginning to realize that it's all by design, is that the fundamental nature of the financial manipulation within the United States and in the Western world absolutely must change. We cannot go forward without that change. And I'm extremely hopeful for what that's going to look like over the next 9 to 12 months. We've got a very, I think, turbulent election season ahead of us. We may perhaps not even get all of the way to that election under
Yeah.
normal circumstances. We really don't know.
Yeah.
But 2025 represents halfway through this decade, and I would characterize that as a symbolic mark in the longitudinal timing of this generation. Moving towards 2030, I think the name of the game is to reverse their Agenda 2030 and put our Agenda 2030 into place, and how that ties into finance, economy, the changeover in law, the restructuring and retraining of constitutional courts. These are questions for a really good discussion, but I just can't give a good prediction on the timeline.
Yes, that's so true that it has to be. It's a whole other discussion, and there's so much going on behind the scenes that we're not seeing that's moving things along, and we don't see it. SG, you're a beautiful guy. We're so lucky to have you with us at this time. You've got an important role, and I'm so happy to be able to have these discussions with you. And I know that my listeners are as well, and that you have to go now. So. Thank you so much. I know my questions have been a little bit wandering because there's just so many pieces to try to tie in, and I just keep trying. So thank you so much for being with me again. Come back soon.
Thank you very much. God bless. I look forward to coming back, Carrington.
Right on.
And that was SG Anon, the QNewsPatriot. You can find him online on Rumble at QNewsPatriot with a green check mark, on Twitter X at the QNewsPatriot with a blue check mark, and on Truth Social at Real SG Anon with a red check mark. So give us a thumbs up and subscribe and share this talk show. Also, we've added a donate link at the bottom of the show notes if you'd like to contribute to this humanitarian project. With more great conversations coming up soon.